There is something very comforting about the way we tend to tell the story of Seneca Falls. It usually goes something like this. In 1848, a group of women gathered in a small town in New York, declared that women were equal to men, demanded the right to vote, and in doing so launched the women's rights movement in the United States. It's clear, it's linear, and it gives us a nice, tidy origin point, somewhere we can point to and say, this is where it all began. And to be clear, that version of the story isn't wrong, but it is incomplete in a way that matters. Because when we smooth the story out like that, we lose the texture of what actually happened in that room, and more importantly, we lose the tensions that were already shaping the movement from the very beginning. We lose the fact that Seneca Falls was not simply a moment of universal inclusion, but a moment in which a very particular version of woman was being articulated, defended, and made legible within American political culture. So before we even step into that chapel in July of 1848, we need to pull back just a little bit and ask a different question. Not what happened at Seneca Falls, but what made Seneca Falls possible. Because this didn't come out of nowhere. I'm Professor Meredith, and this is Seneca Falls and the Limits of Universal Womanhood.
Something that's, kind of bitchy.
Bitchy?
Pretty bitchy.
Bitchy? I know.
Great, keep that bitchy energy.
Well, first of all, you're a little bitchy. That's next level bitchy.
By the time Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott sat down with a small group of women in Waterloo, New York in the early July of 1848 and decided, somewhat impulsively, somewhat inevitably, to organize a convention, they were not inventing women's political thought. They were simply stepping into it. For decades, women had been deeply involved in reform movements across the United States. They had organized abolitionist societies, circulated petitions, raised funds, written pamphlets, and perhaps, most importantly, learned how to speak in public about issues that were considered political. That last part mattered more than it might seem at first glance, because public speech itself was not something women were universally encouraged or even permitted to engage in. As the Library of Congress notes in its overview of the movement, many of the women who would become leaders in the suffrage movement served what it calls their political apprenticeships in these earlier reform efforts. They learned how to navigate resistance, how to organize collectively, and how to articulate claims about justice in a language that could be heard in a broader public sphere. This is the world that walks into Seneca Falls. This is the point where I want to bring up the godmother of women's history, Gerda Lerner. She's incredibly useful in examining this event, not because she gives us a theoretical framework to apply, but because she reminds us of something deceptively simple. Seneca Falls matters not because it created women's political consciousness, but because it made that consciousness visible. That distinction changes how we understand everything that follows. Because if we think of Seneca Falls as the beginning, we imagine a moment of creation. But if we understand it as a moment of visibility, then what we're looking at is something else entirely. A moment when ideas that have been developing in smaller, more fragmented ways are brought together, formalized, and presented to the public in a way that cannot be easily ignored. And with that visibility comes consequences. The convention itself is held on July 19th and 20th of 1848 in the Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca Falls. It was not especially large by modern standards. Around 300 people attended over the course of 2 days, a mix of women, men, many of whom were already involved in reform networks in the region. But what the convention lacked in size, it made up for in ambition. On the first day, the meeting was restricted to women alone. On the second, men were invited to attend and participate. And over the course of those 2 days, the central document of the convention, the Declaration of Sentiments, was read, debated, revised, and ultimately signed by 68 women and 32 men. That document is where we need to slow down, because it was doing a tremendous amount of work. It was modeled explicitly on the Declaration of Independence, and the Declaration of Sentiments adopts its structure, its tone, and its rhetorical authority. It opens with a line that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with the founding documents of the United States. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. This was not subtle imitation, it was deliberate appropriation. The authors of the document, primarily Stanton, are not simply arguing that women deserve better treatment. They are placing women within the same moral and political framework that had been used to justify the American Revolution itself. They are saying, in effect, that the exclusion of women from political life is not just unfortunate or unfair, it is a violation of the very principles on which the nation claimed to be founded. And they didn't stop there. After this opening, the document moves into what has often been described as a list of grievances, echoing the structure of the Declaration of Independence again. But instead of listing the abuses of a distant monarchy, it lists the ways in which women have been systematically excluded from political, legal, and social power within their own society. The history of mankind, the document declares, is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. This is not a mild statement. That is an accusation, and it is followed by specifics. Women are denied the right to vote, they are excluded from participation in government, they are subject to laws in the making of which they have no voice, they are deprived of property rights in marriage, they face unequal access to education and employment. The document builds, point by point, a case that women are not simply disadvantaged, but structurally subordinated within the legal and political system. And then, after laying out this case, it arrives at its conclusion, that women, as citizens, are entitled to all the rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens of these United States. It is a sweeping claim, and within that sweeping claim lies the moment that makes even some supporters uneasy. Because among the 12 resolutions presented at the convention, there is one that stands out. One that didn't pass unanimously. One that, even within a room full of reformers, felt like it might be going too far. And that was the demand for women's right to vote. Resolved, the document states, that it is a duty of women of this country to secure to themselves and their sacred right to the elective franchise. Now, it's very easy from a modern perspective to look at that demand and see it as obvious, even inevitable. But in 1848, this was nowhere near a consensus position, even among people who supported women's rights more broadly. Some attendees worried that insisting on suffrage would make the movement seem too radical, too unrealistic, too easy to dismiss. And that hesitation tells us something important. Because up to this point, much of women's political involvement had been framed in terms of moral influence. Women were seen, by themselves as well as by others, as having a role to play in shaping society through influence within the home, the church, and reform movements. They could advocate for temperance, for abolition, for education, for moral reform, and they could do so in a way that did not fully disrupt the idea that women belonged primarily in the private sphere. But voting is different. Voting means stepping fully into the public sphere as political actors in their own right. It meant claiming not just the ability to influence power, but the right to exercise it directly. And that shift from influence to power is where the stakes of the movement become much clearer. This is also the moment when another figure in the room becomes crucial. Ironically, it's a man. However, it is Frederick Douglass, so we're going to give him a pass. Douglass attends the convention on the second day. He listens to the debate over the suffrage resolution, and when it becomes clear that there is hesitation, he speaks in support of it. Douglass had already been deeply involved in abolitionist activism, and his presence at Seneca Falls is part of a broader connection between the movements for abolition and women's rights. But what matters here is not just that he was present, but what he said. Right is of no sex, he argues. Truth is of no color. And more directly, he insists that women are justly entitled to all we claim for man. This is not a cautious endorsement. It is a clear statement that the principles being invoked at Seneca Falls, equality, rights, citizenship, cannot be selectively applied. And his support matters, because the suffrage resolution, which had faced severe resistance, ultimately passes. Not unanimously, but decisively enough to become part of the platform emerging from the convention. And this moment, this convergence of women's rights and abolitionist thought, is one of the most powerful in the history of the movement. But it's also one of the most fragile. Because what Douglass is doing in that moment is placing women's rights within a broader struggle about who counts as a full participant in American democracy. And this is where I want to bring in the writings of W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois, writing decades later about Reconstruction, makes a point that resonates strongly here. That the expansion of rights in the United States has never been a smooth, inevitable process. It has always been contested, negotiated, and fought over in very concrete ways. Not in theory, but in practice, in rooms like that one at the Wesleyan Chapel. And what we see at Seneca Falls is one of those moments of contestation where a group of women and some men are attempting to redraw the boundaries of political inclusion. But even as those boundaries are being pushed outward, they are also being shaped. And that shaping also matters. If we sit with Seneca Falls for a moment, really sit with it, rather than pushing past it as a symbolic starting point, we start to notice something that is both subtle and incredibly important. When the Declaration of Sentiments declares that all men and women are created equal, it is making a universal claim. It's deliberately invoking a language that suggests total inclusion, a kind of moral clarity that leaves very little room for ambiguity. But the women who are making that claim are doing so from within a particular social world, one that shapes how that universality is understood, who it can reach, and who it leaves behind. Because the woman being imagined in that document is not just any woman. She is a woman who can be recognized by society at large. She is a woman whose claims can be heard without immediately destabilizing the entire social order. She is respectable. She is, more often than not, white. That last part is not something the document says outright, but it is something the historical context makes very clear. This is where it becomes useful to bring in some lived reality, because one of the things that becomes obvious when you look at the broader women's rights movement of the mid-19th century is that not all women were experiencing exclusion in the same way, and not all women were positioned equally within the movement itself. And this is where Angela Davis helps clarify what is happening without pulling us completely away from the history. Davis points out in her work on the early suffrage movement that the experiences of white women were often treated as representative of women as a whole, even when those experiences were not shared by women of different racial or economic backgrounds. This was not always a conscious decision, but it was a structural one. The women who had access to platforms, to literacy, to reform networks, and public visibility were disproportionately white and middle class, and so the version of womanhood that had become politically legible was shaped by their lives. Which means that when Seneca Falls speaks in universal terms, it is doing so through a particular filter. And we can see the limits of that particular filter more clearly when we look at who else is speaking in this period and what they're saying. Now, if you listened to our last episode on bitchy history, this part might sound a little familiar, but I'm always happy to reshare important things. A few years after Seneca Falls in 1851, at another women's rights convention, this time in Akron, Ohio, a woman named Sojourner Truth stands up to speak. Truth had been born into slavery in New York and had escaped with her infant daughter in 1826 and had spent years working as an abolitionist speaker before arriving at that convention. She was not part of the same social world as many of the women who had organized Seneca Falls. She didn't have access to formal education. She'd lived a life marked by forced labor, violence, and constant threat of separation from her family members. And when she speaks, she does not adopt the language of delicacy or moral refinement that often frame discussions of womanhood in white reform circles. Instead, she says, "I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me, and can any man do more than that?" There is a directness in this that cuts through assumptions underlying much of the earlier conversation. Because one of the arguments often made against women's rights in this period was that women were too fragile, too delicate, too dependent to participate in political life, that they needed protection rather than power, that their role was to influence, not to act. Truth dismantles that argument simply by describing her own life. No one helps her into carriages, no one lifts her over ditches, no one shields her from labor or violence, and yet she is a woman. And that is the point. This is where the tension becomes impossible to ignore. Because if womanhood can encompass both the respectable, domestically situated women of Seneca Falls and the laboring, formerly enslaved woman standing in Akron, Ohio, then the category itself is far more complex than the language of the Declaration of Sentiments would suggest. And if the category is more complex, then any claim made in its name is a lot more complicated. What Truth is doing in that moment is not rejecting the women's rights movement. She's participating in it. But she's also reshaping it, forcing it to confront realities that it cannot easily absorb into its existing framework. Because the framework that underlies Seneca Falls still carries with it assumptions about what women are like, what women do, and what women need. It assumes a certain relationship to labor, a certain relationship to protection, and to dependency. And those assumptions do not hold for everyone in the United States. This is why her speech resonates so powerfully even now, and why it has been remembered, sometimes inaccurately, sometimes reshaped in retelling, but never entirely forgotten. Because it exposes something that was already present at the beginning of the movement, that the fight for women's rights was never just about adding women into an existing political structure. It was about defining which women would be seen within that structure at all. And this is where we can return to Seneca Falls with fresh eyes. Because once we recognize that the category of woman isn't neutral, we can start to see how the convention itself was operating within a set of constraints. Not constraints in the sense that women were unaware or uninterested in broader inclusion, but constraints in the sense that they were working within a society that had very clear ideas about who could speak, who could be heard, and who could be taken seriously as a political actor. The women who organized Seneca Falls were in many ways pushing against those constraints, but they were also shaped by them. They framed their arguments in terms that would be recognizable within existing political discourse. They drew on the language of the Declaration of Independence. They emphasized moral authority, respectability, and the injustice of being denied rights that they were otherwise qualified to exercise. And that strategy was very effective. It allowed them to enter the conversation. It made them harder to dismiss. But it also meant that the version of womanhood being presented was one that could fit within those existing expectations. And that fit came with limits. We can see those limits not only in who is centered in the movement, but also in how the movement was received. Because as news of the Seneca Falls Convention spread, it did not just generate support, it generated reaction. Some newspapers praised the convention, framing it as a bold and necessary step toward expanding the principles of American democracy. Others mocked it, ridiculed it, and treated it as evidence of social disorder. One paper famously described it as a most insane and ludicrous farce. And that reaction is worth sitting with, not because it tells us that the critics were correct, but because it reveals how threatening the claims being made at Seneca Falls actually were. Because what the convention was proposing was not just a set of reforms, it was a redefinition of political participation. And that kind of redefinition is never received neutrally. These fights aren't smooth, nor are they universally embraced. They're fought over. They're a battle of inches. And what we're watching in the years immediately following Seneca Falls is the beginning of a long, uneven struggle about who is going to be included in the political community and on what terms. All that being said, this is where we need to be careful not to flatten the story into something overly cynical, because it would be easy at this point to say that Seneca Falls was exclusionary, that it centered a narrow version of womanhood, and just leave it at that. But that would be missing something, because the women at Seneca Falls were not simply drawing boundaries, they were also breaking them. They were challenging laws, customs, and expectations that had long defined women as outside the political sphere altogether. They were insisting in a very public and very deliberate way that women were not just moral beings, not just domestic actors, not just supporters of reform, but citizens. And that claim mattered. It mattered even if it was incomplete. It mattered even if it was shaped by the limitations of its moment, because it created space that others would be able to enter, challenge, and eventually expand. What happened after Seneca Falls is in many ways just as important as what happens within it, because the convention does not end the conversation, it amplifies it. Almost immediately, the ideas articulating in that small chapel begin to move outward, carried by the people who had been in the room and by those who heard about it afterward. Within weeks, another meeting is held in Rochester, this time larger and more public and more firmly established as part of the emerging movement rather than a one-off gathering. And then it keeps going. Annual conventions begin to take shape, creating a rhythm of organization and visibility that sustains the movement beyond that initial moment. These meetings are not identical to Seneca Falls, but they build on it, refining arguments, expanding networks, and slowly transforming what had been a localized event into a national conversation. This is how movements grow, not through a single defining moment, but through repetition, adaptation, and persistence. And yet, even as this movement expands, the tensions that were present at Seneca Falls don't disappear. If anything, they become more pronounced. Because once the argument for women's rights enters the public sphere in a sustained way, it begins to encounter other political developments that reshape its trajectory. The most significant of these, in the decades following Seneca Falls, is the question of suffrage itself. Not just whether women should have the vote, but how that demand intersects with other struggles over citizenship, particularly in the aftermath of the Civil War. And this is where the story becomes more complicated in a way that's very difficult to smooth over. Because the alliance between abolition and women's rights that have been so visible in moments like Frederick Douglass's support at Seneca Falls does not hold in the same way once the stakes shift. After the Civil War, the United States enters a period of Reconstruction, during which the federal government attempts, imperfectly, unevenly, and often violently, to redefine citizenship and rights in the wake of emancipation. The 14th and 15th Amendment extends citizenship and voting rights to formerly enslaved men, fundamentally reshaping the political landscape. And this is where the question that had been implicit at Seneca Falls becomes unavoidable. If rights are being expanded, who gets them first? For many activists who have been involved in both abolition and women's rights, this moment creates a profound tension between them. On one hand, the extension of citizenship and suffrage to black men represents a monumental and necessary shift, one that addresses centuries of enslavement and exclusion. On the other hand, it leaves women, of all races, still excluded from the political system. And not everyone responds to that tension in the same way. Some activists maintain the connection between the struggles, arguing that rights should be extended universally without prioritizing one group over another. Others begin to argue, sometimes explicitly, that educated white women should not be asked to wait while men, particularly black men and immigrants, are enfranchised first. This is not a comfortable part of the story, but it is a necessary one. Angela Davis argues that early suffrage movements were shaped by the social positions of the women who led it, and that those positions influenced not only the goals of the movement, but also its blind spots. When some suffragists began to frame their arguments in ways that prioritized their own inclusion over that of others, they were not stepping outside the logic of the movement, they were just revealing its internal contradictions. They were showing in real time that a movement built on universal language can still produce unequal outcomes. But even as these fractures emerge, the work that began at Seneca Falls does not disappear. It continues through organizing, writing, conventions, and persistent, exhausting advocacy. The Declaration of Sentiments, which had been drafted in a relatively small room in 1848, becomes a reference point, a document that activists return to again and again as they argue for change. It's circulated, cited, and used as a foundation for further demands, even as the movement itself evolves in response to new political realities. And over time, that persistence matters. Because while Seneca Falls does not secure the vote, it helps create the conditions under which the demand can be sustained for decades. It helps establish a language of rights, a framework for political argument, and a spreading network of activists. And those elements taken together are what make long-term change possible. 72 years after Seneca Falls, in 1920, the 19th Amendment is ratified, granting women in the United States the right to vote. And it would be very tempting to draw a line straight from one moment to the other, to say this led to that, to frame Seneca Falls as the beginning of an inevitable march toward equality. But that's not what history shows, because the path from 1848 to 1920 is not straight. It's uneven, it's contested, it's shaped by moments of progress and moments of severe backlash. And even in 1920, that story is not complete, because the right to vote, as it is granted at that moment, is not equally accessible to all women. Black women in the South, in particular, continue to face systemic barriers to voting for decades as Jim Crow laws and other forms of voter suppression limit their ability to exercise that right in practice. Which brings us back, once again, to the question that has been threading through this entire episode. Not simply whether rights are granted, but who is able to exercise them. So if we step back now at the end of this story and look again at Seneca Falls, what do we see? We see a moment of extraordinary ambition. A group of women, and some men, gather to assert that women are citizens, that they are entitled to rights, and that their exclusion from political life is unjust. We see a document that draws on the language of the nation's founding to make that claim in a way that cannot easily be dismissed. We see the beginning of a movement that will grow, adapt, and persist over decades. But we also see something else. We see the early formation of a category, woman. A category that is presented as universal, but is shaped by social realities of the people who are articulating it. A category that includes, but does not include everyone equally. A category that will be contested, expanded, and redefined over time, but never in a way that's simple or uncontested. And this is where I want to return to Gerda Lerner, whose framing becomes so important to hold on to at the end of this episode. Because when she talks about Seneca Falls, she does not describe it as the creation of women's political thought, but as the moment when that thought becomes visible, when it enters the historical record in a way that demands recognition. And once something is visible, it can be challenged, it can be expanded, it can be argued over, but it can't be ignored. So the next time you hear Seneca Falls described as the beginning of the women's rights movement, it's worth remembering what that actually means. It doesn't mean that everything started there. It means that something became undeniable there. That a group of women stood up and said, we are part of this political system, we always have been, and we are no longer willing to be written out of it. Next time, we're going to follow that question forward into the fractures of the suffrage movement itself, into the moments when unity gave way to conflict and where the fight for rights becomes very explicitly a fight over who gets to claim them first. Because if Seneca Falls opened the door, what came after made it very clear that not everyone was going to be able to walk through it at the same time. I'm Professor Meredith, and this has been Bitchy History.
History.
History. History. History.
History.
What a bitch, right?